So along with the political control came the corruption of science. Okay, and I've talked a little bit about the stories. There's many, many stories, some in my book and others you may have heard of, where basically independent science is not allowed into this critique of how this system works. What we have is what I call the best science that money can buy. An important part of this is the control of the university system. You know, I talk a lot with university agriculture professors, and they say the students would love to study sustainable farming, but there's no money for it. All the money that the universities have now are coming from the biotech corporations, and they're controlling the research agenda. That's especially true in Hawaii right now, which is the ground zero for GM agriculture. This is where all the seeds are grown that are being farmed in the Middle West. Most of them come from Hawaii. And all the big companies are there because you have 3 growing seasons, okay? And I did a study of Hawaii of GM contamination of the fields there. This is a photograph. They just leave the GM corn out and then birds eat it and it's just left out in the ground. Their field practices are abysmal. And in fact, Kaua'i finally, this is kind of an old slide, I did this years ago, but they just won a case against Pioneer because the other thing you need to know about Hawaii is they have like 2 to 3 growing seasons a year, right? So they're spraying 2 and 3 times a year more than they do in the Midwest in here. And so there's more and more and more chemicals, and there are experimental chemicals being used there. And the dust from that is going into everyone's home and making them sick and getting them sick in the schools. And they just won their lawsuit in Kaua'i and their Pioneer was fined for making people who live around their farms ill. And they also had been successful in getting a local law saying that these GM companies needed to report with their use of pesticides. But then Syngenta goes in and sued the county of Kaua'i to say, no, you can't do that. So the county, Gary Hooser, he went to Switzerland to the Syngenta meeting recently and he said, how dare you sue us for the right to poison us and our families and children? When Switzerland, you don't use these chemicals here in your own home country. But you're suing us for the right to use them on us and our children in our fields. I could talk a lot about the contamination problems, but again, it's pretty well established. The one thing I want to leave you with is that it's intentional. Like I've said, they actually in Hawaii, they give GM seeds to the school kids to plant in their school gardens. You know, so as the quote here at the bottom admits, the industry pretty much admits they want to impose this in the system. They want GM everywhere, so we no longer have a choice. This pretty much shows the situation in Hawaii. And the silencing, another friend of mine, Hector Valenzuela. It's a great story, which I can give you a link to, or you can just look it up. But again, his university, which has been attacking him, is taking money from Monsanto. So if we're really honest about this, we're going to have to also, I think, admit our own role in allowing this to happen. We're living in a really distracted world, aren't we? You know, where entertainment has taken the place of information. Right? So I want to encourage you to try and get in that other line there. Try and sign up for the inconvenient truths. And also to engage in the political process. As the poet Wendell Berry says, the time has come. Let me ask you guys, is the situation bad enough that you'd like to see it change? Yes, right. Once you really have the courage to face how bad it is and how far we've come along on this process, I think that we can finally say, I'm going to get busy. Not just our own personal health, but the political aspects of this have to change. And one speaker yesterday, I think it was, said something really interesting. He said that the problem is we're organized around a false narrative. I completely agree. And then he said, but I don't know what to do about it. Well, I think I do, and that is change the narrative. Let's change the story we're telling ourselves. This is why stories are so important. Let's change the story we're telling ourselves. And one thing I know about being a storyteller is that you get to decide how the story ends. So if we change the story, we can change how this is going to come out, right? How do we retell the story of agriculture? The first thing we need to do is think about how it's been told to us. You know, GMOs are always sold as something you need because of some scary pest or scary disease or scary problems, right? It's all a fear-based scarcity. It kind of goes back to that being kicked out of the garden and being told, you know, we're going to have to suffer, right? So the level of awareness that we have about ourselves as well as the world is an issue we have to look at. And the other thing that I've learned is that we don't really ask the right questions. When genetic engineers decided that they wanted, this is a scientist who helped develop BT, or recombinant BT told me this. She's a reformed scientist. She's actually very much in opposition to this technology. She told me that genetic engineers only ask one question: does it work? That's all they want to know. They want to know, they're engineers. They're going to go from point A to point B. They're not biologists. They're not ecologists. They're not even just human beings concerned about their health. So the question that we need to ask is, what else does it do? Sure, we can make it work, but what else does it do? And we're not asking that question, just as an example. I'd also like to give a shout out for common sense. We know this is wrong. We intuitively understand this situation is not good for us. And yet, you know, we seem to be really impelled to passivity, and I'm not quite sure why that is. But let me tell you one more story. When I grew up in the Bay Area, this is where my mom and I used to go and get apricots and cherries and fruit that we'd can in the summer. It was called the Valley of Heart's Delight, just south of San Francisco. And this is what it's today. The Valley of Heart's Delight is now Silicon Valley. And doesn't that just sum up the difference between where we were and where we are now? Hasn't that long ago. It was not that long ago. But clearly technology has run so far and so fast ahead, it hasn't kept up with our humanity, with ethics, with morality, even with just basic science. Which brings us back to this question: how are we going to feed ourselves? And I say the question itself is the one I want to just give you here. How do we feed ourselves? Not how are we going to be fed? It's important to retain the right to feed yourself as an essential human right. And there's important science behind this point. I love science. This slide just represents, I want to say that I really love science. It's really helpful. It's like Gandhi said about civilization, I wish there was more of it. I wish there was more science involved in this. But the issue of technology is very important because technology is important to agriculture productivity and health. And so the biotech industry, along with the United Nations and the World Bank, got together and they asked this question: what is the optimal technology for science and development in agriculture? And so they got 800 stakeholders. Just think of the size of the story, including biotech and NGOs, 400 selected experts, I've interviewed some of them, and 110 countries in a multidisciplinary, multi-year study all over the world. It was the most extensive worldwide study on agriculture ever done. It looked at this issue of technology in agriculture from every possible angle. And it was endorsed when it was done by 58 countries in the world. So I highly recommend that you look up IAASTD and you read the executive summary, because I can only have a minute to tell you what they found. But basically, they found that genetically modified organisms are not only not the answer, they're causing more harm than good, even the good that the companies are selling it for. What they say is that agroecology methods of agriculture, the ones we know to be productive and also have the culture of agriculture preserved and clean water and clean soil, that these local and traditional and regional agricultural practices that have sustained humanity for 10,000 years, That's what we need to keep doing, and we need to support that with the knowledge and with the progress we've had. We're not talking about going backwards. We're talking about appropriate technology and optimal use. Well, why haven't you heard of IASTD, I want to know? Has anybody here heard of it before I told you? You know why? Because it came out wrong. So the biotech industry has covered it up, and the media goes along with that. I just want to briefly mention that this is the kind of agriculture, just to give you a different picture of it. Again, women are a very important part of this picture. Local seeds, local knowledge. And science is a very important part of productivity and health in agriculture. Now, this is a recent report that's very important. You can Google SRI. What happened was, you probably heard about the Green Revolution. Well, basically the Green Revolution was all about reforming, using natural breeding, to plants, especially rice, to take more herbicides and fertilizers. So it was produced by the chemical companies. I have the story of how this happens in my book. It was the Green Revolution was about starting to use chemical fertilizers in agriculture. And yes, they got more productivity from that, but there were many environmental and social consequences to that. These farmers in India developed something called SRI, which involves a planting method, where they have been able to vastly increase the productivity of agriculture. And it's called the most significant development in the past 50 years for the world's small-scale farmers. Most of the world still feeds itself from small-scale farmers. And in California, I can tell you, we're back to that. And we have, in my county now, local agriculture. We basically have our own agriculture, and it's mostly organic. And we're saving the soil, we're saving the water, we're giving fair wages to the farm workers, and we're ridding ourselves of this chemical dependency. It can be done. And here's some examples of mostly grass-fed agriculture in Marin. And we're teaming up with science to validate the carbon capture of using composting that takes the minerals in the soil and captures the carbon. And we're validating that. So the farmers are not only able to provide more food and healthier water and make more profit, they're also contributing to reducing climate change. So these are the multiple benefits of agriculture done right. And I must say that NAFTA and GATT and all these free trade agreements are very adamant about eradicating the multiple benefits of agriculture and focusing only on corporate industrial monocultures. So these free trade agreements are one way to oppose what we don't want to have happen. The other thing I really love that's happening are seed banks. Probably your local library or something in your community, like my community, is doing something really good to bring back the kind of agriculture we want. I love seed libraries. These are your local library where you go to get your books. Now a lot of them have seed lending libraries, which are bringing back our ability to grow things for ourselves in the areas where we live. So I really encourage anything you can do to stop the criminalization and restriction of seeds. But I'd also like to say, have some fun. Get the artists, get the poets, get the music, get the community together to do this work. It's not something we can do by ourselves. It's something that can unite us in our communities and where we live. We need a new model. The good thinking about this is we have to change, but we need a new model for change. So I want to go back to the Garden of Eden for a moment. Some people think that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden because they ate of the fruit of the forbidden tree. Go back and read the story. I looked at all the versions of the Bible I could find, and that's not actually what happened. There were two trees in the Garden of Eden. The tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And what God says is the way the story goes in the Bible is it says, you're out of here because you blew it, but the reason I'm kicking you out of the garden is to prevent something from happening. I'm going to prevent you from having access to the tree of life. And the ending of the story is, in that story, there was an army of angels and a flaming, twirling sword in front of the tree of life. And the tree of life is such an important part of all of our stories of humanity. Every culture practically has a tree of life story. And many people have suggested that the tree of life is the double helix DNA. And this is a warning in that creation story that life is sacred and to stay away from manipulating this double helix from the DNA. Now I want to close with a couple of things. I want to talk for a second about other creation stories, because I want to suggest this as one of the models. There are many, many creation stories in the world, and there's another model. And with your permission, and I'll be available for questions afterwards too, but I want to read you a story with your permission, because my friend Robin Kimmerer, who's a Native American scientist and educator, wrote a beautiful story in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, about herb plant traditions. And she tells the story of Sky Woman falling, which I think really helps us learn what we need to know. So I'm going to read it to you. Just take 2 minutes. This is a beautiful Oneida artist that did the story illustration. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear, or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below. But in that emptiness, there were many eyes looking back up at her. They saw a small object, like a mere dust mote, in the light beam. As it grew closer, they could see it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind her as she spiraled down towards them. The geese nodded to one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath her to break her fall. Far from the only home she'd ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward, and so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for so much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather: loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated up in their midst and offered his back for her to rest on. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home, and they discussed how they might bring that to her. So all the animals, to shorten the story, went down, and they all tried to dive down and get some earth for her and bring it back up for her, because in her hand she had grabbed onto the tree of life just before she fell, and she held the seeds of the tree of life in her hand. And all the otter and the beaver and the sturgeon, the fish, they all went down and they were unable to do it. Until finally the muskrat was left. And the muskrat, who was the weakest diver of all, said, "I'm going to try." And he goes down, and he was gone for a really, really long time. And nothing happened, and everybody waited. And finally some bubbles came up, and the muskrat came up, and he had died. But in his little claws, he clutched some soil. He gave his life for this, but they were able to take it out of his paw and spread it on the back of the turtle. And she danced with such gratitude for having some soil. She danced and danced and danced on the back of the turtle and created the land we now know as the earth that we live on. And she was moved by these extraordinary gifts, and she sang in thanksgiving. And the land grew, and she was able to plant the seeds that she'd carried with them. And together, all of them had formed what we now know as Turtle Island. I know. What if we had that creation story to carry us forward? What if we were really able to understand the abundance, the cooperation of species? I love the part where they called council, where they said, how can we do this together? I love that part. I love the part about how the species cooperated. I have a friend who says what we need are natural strategies to inform our social strategies. There's so much that nature can teach us. I'm going to close with a part of my book, where I close my book with the same words about seeds. Seeds are the messengers for the past. They are an embodiment of hope for the future. Seeds are a promise of life to come. They endure because they're generous. They survive by being resilient, abundant, and adaptable. The story of seeds is also our story. We can be guided by the way of seeds and by knowing that what we do to ourselves, we do to seeds. I think that the most important thing that we need to do is to value beauty, value abundance, and value each other as we reconnect to the natural integrity of the world. Thank you.